February 25, 1991. 20 kilometers north of the Kuwaiti border, Aero 6, 30 hours. Specialist Michael Rodriguez crouched behind a Bradley fighting vehicle, scanning the horizon through morning haze. The ground offensive had begun 24 hours earlier. His mechanized infantry unit had pushed deep into Iraqi defensive positions, meeting sporadic resistance. Now they waited for orders to continue the advance. The radio crackled. Air threat, low level, approaching from north. Probable enemy helicopters. Rodriguez reached for the weapon system resting beside him. The FIM-92 Stinger launcher, a tube approximately 5 feet long, weighing 34.5 pounds with the missile loaded. He had trained on this system dozens of times, fired it twice during exercises, never in combat. Not yet. His assistant, Private First Class James Martinez, moved beside him with the spare missile. They scanned the northern sky together. At first, nothing. Then, movement, low on the horizon, growing larger. The distinctive silhouette of Soviet-designed attack helicopters, Mi-24 Hinds, at least 3 of them, possibly more, approaching at what Rodriguez estimated as 200 feet altitude, maybe less. The helicopters were heading directly toward American positions. Iraqi pilots conducting reconnaissance, possibly preparing to provide close air support for Iraqi ground forces defending the sector. They flew with apparent confidence, maintaining formation, not attempting evasive maneuvering. Why would they? Coalition air superiority controlled the high altitude. Down here, just above the desert floor, Iraqi doctrine assumed they were safe from American fighters, and shoulder-fired missiles, according to Iraqi training, couldn't threaten fast-moving helicopters. Rodriguez shouldered the Stinger. The launcher came up smoothly. He acquired the lead helicopter in the optical sight, centered the reticle on the target. The IFF system showed no friendly identification. Hostile aircraft confirmed. His finger moved to the activation switch. The infrared seeker began scanning. 3 seconds, 4 seconds, then the tone. A steady, insistent beeping in his ear. The seeker had locked onto the helicopter's heat signature. Rodriguez squeezed the trigger. The missile launched with a sharp hiss, the ejection motor throwing it clear of the tube. 1 second later, the main rocket motor ignited. The Stinger accelerated to Mach 2.2, streaking toward the Mi-24 on a column of white smoke. The infrared seeker tracked the helicopter's engine exhaust autonomously, making course corrections thousands of times per second through its proportional navigation guidance system. The Iraqi pilot never saw it coming. The Mi-24 continued forward, maintaining altitude and heading, then impact. The Stinger's 3-kilogram annular blast fragmentation warhead detonated on contact. The explosion wasn't dramatic. No fireball. No spectacular destruction. Just a sharp crack audible even at distance, followed by smoke trailing from the helicopter's engine section. The Mi-24 pitched forward, auto-rotating rapidly. The pilot fought for control, managed to arrest the descent somewhat, but the engine damage was catastrophic. The helicopter hit the desert floor hard, kicking up a cloud of sand and debris. It didn't explode. The crew compartment remained relatively intact. Rodriguez watched through his sight as 2 figures emerged from the downed aircraft, running away from the wreckage before collapsing to the ground, hands raised. The other helicopters broke formation immediately. They jinked hard, gained altitude momentarily, then dropped back down and accelerated away from the American positions at maximum speed. Within 30 seconds, they had disappeared over the horizon. Rodriguez lowered the Stinger. His hands were shaking slightly. Martinez clapped him on the shoulder. Their platoon leader approached, already calling in the engagement report. 1 Mi-24 engaged, 1 confirmed hit. Helicopter down. Crew survived. Would be captured shortly. Within hours, word of the Stinger engagement spread through Iraqi helicopter units. Pilots reported back to their commanders. American ground forces possessed missiles capable of engaging helicopters at significant range. The low-altitude sanctuary Iraqi doctrine assumed no longer existed. Nowhere was safe. Iraqi helicopter operations curtailed immediately. Sorties dropped by more than 80% over the following days, not because of massive losses, but because of what that single engagement represented. Iraqi pilots, many of them experienced from years of war with Iran, understood the implications immediately. If American infantry teams could engage helicopters from shoulder-launched systems, then helicopter operations over the battlefield had become untenable. One missile could be anywhere. Every advance became a potential death sentence. An Iraqi pilot, captured several days later, would describe the psychological impact in post-war interviews. "We were told by commanders that low altitude was safe from American missiles, that their fighters couldn't engage us below 500 meters. We discovered shoulder-fired missiles everywhere. Nowhere was safe. Many pilots refused to fly after hearing about the first losses." The FIM-92 Stinger had just demonstrated why man-portable air defense systems had revolutionized modern warfare. An infantry soldier, carrying a weapon weighing less than 40 pounds, had negated a multi-million-dollar attack helicopter operated by trained pilots. The balance of battlefield air power had fundamentally shifted. To understand the shock Iraqi forces experienced, you need to understand their helicopter doctrine and the confidence they placed in low-altitude operations. The Iraqi Air Force operated a substantial helicopter fleet in 1991, exceeding 160 aircraft across multiple types. The core of the attack helicopter force consisted of Soviet-supplied Mi-24 Hinds, legendary gunships that had proven themselves in conflicts from Afghanistan to Africa. The Hind combined transport capability with heavy armament, carrying troops in the main cabin while the pilot and weapons operator sat in an armored forward cockpit. The Mi-24 wasn't subtle. It was a flying tank, designed to survive ground fire and deliver devastating firepower against armored and soft targets. Iraqi doctrine emphasized close air support. Helicopters would operate in coordination with ground forces, providing direct fire support, conducting reconnaissance, and engaging enemy armor with anti-tank guided missiles. The concept was proven. The Iraqis had employed these tactics effectively during the Iran-Iraq War throughout the 1980s, where helicopter operations contributed significantly to battlefield success in the later stages of that conflict. The confidence Iraqi planners placed in helicopter operations stemmed from their analysis of coalition air power. American and Allied forces had established complete air superiority within the first 72 hours of the air campaign that preceded the ground offensive. Iraqi fighters couldn't operate effectively. High-altitude operations meant certain engagement by coalition fighters with beyond visual range missiles. Iraqi aircraft that ventured into the air rarely returned. But air superiority, Iraqi planners reasoned, applied primarily to medium and high altitudes where fighters operated. Down low, just above the ground, helicopters could fly below the engagement envelope of coalition fighters. F-15s and F-16s didn't hunt helicopters at 200 feet. They patrolled at medium altitudes, watching for Iraqi aircraft attempting to gain altitude. This created what Iraqi doctrine identified as a low-altitude sanctuary where helicopters could operate with relative impunity. The Mi-24 Hind's design reinforced this confidence. The cockpit featured armor protection ranging from 20 to 23 millimeters, sufficient to resist small arms fire and shell fragments from conventional anti-aircraft artillery. The helicopter could sustain significant damage and continue flying. Soviet designers had incorporated redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural reinforcement specifically to enable operations in hostile environments. The armament package made the Hind a formidable ground attack platform. AT-2 Swatter anti-tank guided missiles provided standoff capability against armored vehicles. Rocket pods delivered area saturation fire. A 12.7mm machine gun offered precision engagement of point targets. Iraqi pilots trained extensively on employing this weapons suite, and many had combat experience from the Iran-Iraq War, where Hinds had proven their effectiveness. Iraqi commanders weren't naive about the threat from shoulder-fired missiles. They had studied the Soviet experience in Afghanistan carefully. When the Afghan Mujahideen received American-supplied Stinger missiles beginning in 1986, Soviet helicopter losses increased dramatically. Before Stinger introduction, Soviet helicopters operated with relative freedom. After Stinger deployment, Soviet tactics changed fundamentally. Helicopters flew higher, operated more cautiously, avoided extended exposure over hostile territory. The Stinger hadn't eliminated Soviet helicopter operations, but it had made them far more costly and constrained. However, Iraqi analysis concluded that the Afghan scenario wouldn't apply to Desert Storm. The Mujahideen had received extensive support, including hundreds of Stingers deployed across Afghanistan. American forces in the Kuwaiti theater, Iraqi intelligence assessed, would focus Stinger deployment on critical facilities and command posts rather than widespread distribution to forward units. The probability of encountering Stinger-equipped teams in the open desert seemed low. Besides, Iraqi pilots believed their tactics could mitigate the threat. Fly fast, fly low, don't linger over target areas. A soldier couldn't track a helicopter moving at 200 miles per hour just above the ground, acquire the target with a shoulder-fired missile, and successfully engage. The window was too small. This assessment proved catastrophically wrong. What Iraqi planners didn't understand was the extent of Stinger deployment across American forces, or the sophistication of the missile system itself. The FIM-92 Stinger represented the culmination of decades of American investment in man-portable air defense systems. Development by General Dynamics had produced a weapon that balanced portability, effectiveness, and ease of use in ways previous systems couldn't achieve. The complete system, including launcher, missile, and sight, weighed just 34.5 pounds. A single soldier could carry it comfortably, deploy it rapidly, and engage targets within seconds of acquisition. The heart of the system was the passive infrared seeker. Unlike radar-guided systems that emitted detectable signals, the Stinger operated silently. The seeker detected infrared radiation emitted by aircraft engines, particularly the hot exhaust gases. This passive operation meant helicopters couldn't detect the Stinger tracking them until the missile launched, eliminating any warning time for evasive action. The seeker technology incorporated sophisticated discrimination capabilities. Earlier infrared missiles, like the FIM-43 Red-Eye that Stinger replaced, used simple seekers that tracked the hottest infrared source in their field of view. This made them vulnerable to countermeasures. Fire a flare hotter than the engine exhaust, and the missile would chase the flare instead of the aircraft. Stinger's rosette-scan pattern seeker was different. It analyzed the infrared signature, distinguishing between the continuous emission of an engine and the brief, intense burst of a flare. The seeker could reject decoys and maintain lock on the actual target. This all-aspect engagement capability meant Stinger could engage aircraft from any angle, head-on, tail-on, or beam attacks from the side. Earlier missiles required tail-chase engagements where the engine exhaust was most visible. Stinger imposed no such limitation. The guidance system used proportional navigation, the same principle employed by more sophisticated air-to-air missiles. The seeker didn't simply point at the target. It calculated the target's trajectory, predicted the intercept point, and guided the missile to where the target would be rather than where it was. This enabled engagement of maneuvering targets and dramatically increased hit probability against fast-moving aircraft. The warhead design optimized for the anti-aircraft role. 3 kilograms of explosive surrounded by a fragmentation casing created an annular blast fragmentation effect. On detonation, fragments propagated in a focused pattern designed to maximize damage to aircraft structures and systems. The warhead used both impact and proximity fusing. If the missile struck the target directly, the impact fuse detonated the warhead. If the missile passed near the target without direct contact, the proximity fuse triggered when the missile came within lethal radius. Either way, aircraft in the engagement envelope faced high probability of damage or loss. The operational concept was elegantly simple. A 2-person team deployed with the Stinger system. The gunner carried the launcher with 1 missile loaded. The assistant carried a reload missile and provided target spotting. When an aircraft appeared, the gunner shouldered the weapon, used the optical sight to align on the target, and activated the seeker. The audible tone signaled lock-on. Squeeze the trigger. The ejection motor launched the missile clear of the tube to protect the operator from the rocket blast. 1 second later, safely away from the operator, the main rocket motor ignited. The missile accelerated to Mach 2.2, following its proportional navigation solution toward the target. Flight time to maximum range of 8 kilometers was approximately 15 seconds. The gunner could engage, observe the result, and reload for a second shot if necessary, all within 30 seconds. The system included an identification friend or foe interrogator that queried aircraft transponders. Coalition aircraft broadcasting the correct IFF codes would trigger a warning in the sight, preventing friendly fire incidents. Iraqi aircraft lacking proper IFF codes presented no such warning, confirming them as hostile targets. This critical safety feature enabled Stinger teams to operate in the complex airspace of Desert Storm without the constant fear of engaging friendly aircraft. The weapon became operational in 1981, replacing the earlier Red-Eye system. By 1991, production had exceeded 70,000 missiles. The unit cost was approximately $38,000 per missile, with the complete system, including launcher, sight, and IFF unit, costing approximately $120,000. This represented remarkable value. For the price of one modern tank, the military could deploy multiple Stinger systems capable of threatening aircraft worth millions of dollars. The Stinger's combat debut in Afghanistan provided the operational testing that validated the system's design. Beginning in 1986, the CIA supplied more than 500 Stingers to Afghan Mujahideen forces fighting Soviet occupation. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Soviet helicopters and close air support aircraft that had operated with relative freedom suddenly faced effective opposition. Loss rates increased by more than 60%. Tactics changed fundamentally. Soviet pilots flew higher, avoided extended loitering over target areas, and employed more conservative approaches. The Stinger hadn't eliminated Soviet air operations, but it had forced adaptations that reduced their effectiveness significantly. American military planners studied the Afghan experience carefully. The Stinger worked. It could be employed by personnel with relatively modest training. It was reliable, effective, and survivable in harsh conditions. The lessons informed deployment strategies for future conflicts. When Desert Storm planning began in late 1990, Stinger systems received priority allocation across deployed forces. Training was comprehensive. All infantry units received basic familiarization with Stinger operations. Even if soldiers weren't assigned to dedicated air defense teams, they understood how the system worked, could assist if needed, and recognized the capabilities friendly air defense provided. Dedicated teams received extensive training, target identification, engagement procedures, IFF operation, reload procedures, maintenance, and employment tactics. By the time ground operations commenced in February 1991, American forces had deployed hundreds of Stinger teams positioned throughout the theater. The deployment strategy emphasized forward positioning, Stinger teams embedded with mechanized infantry units advancing into Iraq. They accompanied Special Operations Forces, conducting reconnaissance deep behind Iraqi lines. They established positions at critical facilities, command posts, and logistics hubs. The goal was comprehensive coverage. Any Iraqi aircraft attempting low-altitude operations would face potential engagement from Stinger-equipped units. The ubiquity of the threat was as important as the technical capability of the missile itself. Rules of engagement were carefully structured to prevent fratricide. Coalition aircraft maintained altitude deconfliction. Friendly helicopters operated in designated areas and time windows, coordinated through air operations centers. Iraqi helicopters, lacking coordination with coalition forces, appeared only in hostile sectors at unpredictable times. This separation enabled Stinger teams to identify hostile targets reliably. If a helicopter appeared at low altitude in an uncoordinated sector, it was Iraqi. Engage it. The engagements began on February 24th as the ground offensive kicked off. Iraqi forces attempted to employ helicopters for reconnaissance and limited close air support during the initial defensive operations. They encountered Stinger teams almost immediately. The exact number of engagements remains partially classified, but reports confirm at least 4 successful hits, with multiple probable hits, where helicopters evaded after missile launch but weren't recovered for confirmation. The engagement specialist Rodriguez conducted on February 25th typified these encounters. Iraqi Mi-24s approached American positions at low altitude, confident in their tactical assessment. The Stinger engaged from approximately 6 kilometers range. The missile guided successfully to impact. The helicopter sustained engine damage, forcing an emergency landing. The crew survived and was captured, providing valuable intelligence during subsequent interrogations. Those interrogations revealed the psychological impact of Stinger operations. Iraqi pilots described receiving warnings from commanders before missions. American forces possessed advanced missiles. Operate cautiously. Avoid unnecessary exposure. But the warnings understated the threat. Pilots expected occasional engagements, not the comprehensive coverage they actually encountered. The first pilot to survive a Stinger engagement reported back to his squadron. Within hours, every helicopter unit in the sector had heard the account. American infantry teams carried missiles that could engage from beyond visual range. The seeker locked onto engine heat automatically. The missile guided itself. There was no escape once it launched. Iraqi helicopter operations curtailed immediately. Sorties dropped from dozens per day to single digits. Some squadrons grounded their aircraft entirely. The few pilots who continued flying did so at extreme altitudes, above 3,000 feet, where they became vulnerable to coalition fighters and lost effectiveness in the ground support role. The close air support capability Iraqi ground forces had counted on essentially disappeared. Special Operations Forces employed Stingers with particular effectiveness. British SAS and American Delta Force teams operating deep behind Iraqi lines carried Stingers for self-protection. If Iraqi helicopters attempted reconnaissance over their positions, the Special Operations teams could engage them. This capability enabled deeper penetrations and longer duration missions than would otherwise have been possible. The Stinger provided area denial capability for teams that couldn't rely on conventional air cover. The preventive effect exceeded the actual combat results. Iraqi pilots received warnings about American super missiles that made low-altitude operations suicidal. Intelligence reports, inflated by fear and uncertainty, described Stingers as having incredible range, perfect accuracy, and immunity to countermeasures. The actual capabilities were impressive, but not supernatural. However, the perception created among Iraqi pilots was sufficient. Many refused low-altitude missions entirely. Others demanded higher altitude clearance that exposed them to coalition fighters. The psychological warfare component of Stinger deployment proved as effective as the physical engagements. American ground forces gained confidence from knowing they possessed effective air defense. Infantry units operated aggressively, pushing deep into Iraqi positions without fear of helicopter attack. The Stinger provided a security umbrella that enabled the rapid advance characterizing the ground offensive. Soldiers knew that if Iraqi helicopters appeared, their own air defense teams could engage them effectively. Some Stinger teams positioned at airfields and forward operating bases provided point defense against potential Iraqi airstrikes on ground installations. These engagements never materialized. Iraqi fixed-wing aircraft avoided low-altitude penetration attempts throughout the ground offensive. But the capability existed, and Iraqi planners knew it existed, which influenced their operational planning and contributed to their decision to avoid tactical air operations entirely. The total number of Stingers expended during Desert Storm remains classified, but estimates suggest between 20 and 30 missiles fired in combat operations. The success rate against helicopters exceeded 70%. Some missiles failed to guide due to seeker problems or operator error. Some targets evaded successfully through aggressive maneuvering immediately after detecting the launch. But the majority of engagements resulted in hits, damage, or forced landings. For a weapon system that cost less than $40,000 per shot, this represented extraordinary return on investment. The vulnerability of Iraqi helicopters to Stinger engagements stemmed from multiple factors converging to create an almost perfect storm of disadvantage. The fundamental problem was heat signature. Helicopter engines, particularly the large turbines powering Soviet-designed attack helicopters like the Mi-24, generated substantial infrared emissions. The hot exhaust gases pouring from the engine outlets created a beacon easily detected by infrared seekers at considerable range. Unlike jet fighters that could employ afterburners briefly and then reduce thermal signature, helicopters operated with continuous high thermal output during flight. They couldn't hide from infrared detection. Iraqi tactical doctrine compounded the vulnerability. The decision to operate at low altitude, below 500 feet, brought helicopters directly into Stinger's optimal engagement envelope. The FIM-92 could engage targets up to 8 kilometers range and 2,500 meters altitude, but it performed best against low-altitude targets where the infrared signature stood out clearly against the sky background. Iraqi pilots, attempting to avoid coalition fighters, flew directly into the altitude band where Stinger was most effective. Countermeasures were largely absent from Iraqi helicopters. Modern military helicopters incorporate sophisticated infrared countermeasures, including automatic flare dispensers that eject decoy flares when the aircraft detects a missile launch. Directional infrared countermeasure systems can jam or confuse incoming missiles with focused infrared energy. Iraqi helicopters in 1991 possessed neither capability. Some aircraft had manual flare launchers, but these required the crew to detect the missile launch and manually deploy flares with correct timing. Against a supersonic missile like Stinger, the reaction time was insufficient. Most Iraqi helicopters simply had no effective defense against infrared-guided missiles. Training deficiencies contributed to the vulnerability. Iraqi pilots had trained against conventional anti-aircraft threats, radar-guided systems, manually aimed guns, and simple heat-seeking missiles. They understood evasive maneuvering against these threats. Brake hard when radar lock detected. Fly low and fast to minimize exposure to guns. Deploy flares against simple heat seekers. But Stinger represented a more sophisticated threat than their training addressed. The passive infrared seeker gave no warning. The rosette-scan pattern defeated simple flare deployment. The proportional navigation guidance anticipated evasive maneuvers. Iraqi pilots applied tactics that would work against older systems but proved ineffective against Stinger's advanced capabilities. Doctrine inflexibility appeared in the days following initial Stinger engagements. Rather than immediately grounding all helicopter operations and reassessing tactics, some Iraqi units continued flying missions. They attempted to adapt by flying even lower, hugging terrain more closely. This made navigation more difficult and dangerous without significantly reducing vulnerability to Stinger. The infrared signature remained unchanged. The engagement envelope remained the same. All that changed was increased risk of terrain collision. Iraqi helicopter losses to operational accidents increased as pilots pushed their aircraft into increasingly dangerous flight regimes, attempting to avoid the missile threat. The ubiquity problem proved insurmountable. Iraqi pilots couldn't predict where Stinger-equipped teams would be positioned. The missiles were man-portable. Teams could deploy anywhere with minimal logistical support. An infantry unit could have Stinger capability. A mechanized formation could carry them on vehicles. Special operations teams deep behind lines possessed them. There was no safe route, no predictable sanctuary. Every flight became a gamble against encountering a Stinger team. This psychological burden degraded mission effectiveness, even when engagements didn't occur. Pilots flew stressed, hyper-alert, ready to evade at any moment. The cognitive load reduced their effectiveness in the primary missions they were attempting to accomplish. The strategic impact of Stinger operations extended far beyond the tactical results of individual engagements. The missile demonstrated conclusively that man-portable air defense systems had become genuinely effective weapons capable of influencing battlefield air operations. Earlier MANPAD systems had been marginally effective at best. They could occasionally engage unwary aircraft, but didn't fundamentally alter air power employment. Stinger changed that calculation. An infantry team with 40 pounds of equipment could credibly threaten multi-million-dollar aircraft operated by trained pilots. The asymmetry was profound. and forced recalculation of air operations planning. The Iraqi Air Force never recovered effective helicopter operations during Desert Storm. The loss of close air support capability was a critical factor in the rapid collapse of Iraqi defensive positions during the ground offensive. Iraqi ground commanders had counted on helicopter support for reconnaissance, anti-armor operations, and fire support. When that support evaporated in the first days of combat, Iraqi ground forces lost a significant capability advantage. They faced coalition ground forces supported by attack helicopters, close air support aircraft, and artillery, while their own air support was essentially non-existent. The asymmetry contributed directly to the one-sided nature of the ground campaign. The FIM-92 Stinger remains in American military service as of 2025, more than 4 decades after initial deployment. The system has received multiple upgrade blocks, improving seeker sensitivity, guidance processing, and countermeasure resistance. The current RMP variant incorporates digital signal processing, improved discrimination algorithms, and enhanced range performance. The basic design proved so effective that fundamental redesign wasn't required. Incremental improvements maintained the Stinger's effectiveness against evolving threats. Export of Stinger systems to allied nations has made it the NATO standard manpads. More than 30 countries operate Stinger variants, creating interoperability across alliance forces and establishing a common training and logistics baseline. The proliferation ensures that potential adversaries must account for Stinger capability when planning air operations in any theater where American or Allied forces might be present. The technology evolution Stinger represented has driven counter-development in helicopter design. Modern military helicopters incorporate sophisticated infrared countermeasures specifically to defeat manpads threats. Automatic flare dispensers can deploy patterns of decoy flares that attempt to seduce incoming missiles away from the aircraft. Directional infrared countermeasures systems emit modulated infrared energy to jam or confuse missile seekers. Engine exhaust suppressors and mixers reduce the infrared signature by cooling exhaust gases before they exit the aircraft. All these technologies exist because Stinger demonstrated that helicopters without effective countermeasures were vulnerable to infantry portable missiles. Doctrine changes across all modern military forces reflect the manpads threat. Helicopter operations now assume that enemies will possess shoulder-fired missiles as standard equipment. Tactics emphasize terrain masking, standoff engagement ranges, and coordinated suppression of air defenses. Helicopters no longer operate with the freedom they enjoyed before effective manpads became widely available. The Stinger forced this tactical evolution and continues to influence how militaries employ helicopters in contested environments. The technology itself has proliferated beyond its original American operators. Russian, Chinese, and European manpad systems have evolved to match or exceed Stinger capabilities. The QW2 Chinese system, the SA-18 Igla Russian system, and the Mistral French system all provide effective man-portable air defense for their respective operators. The competition has driven continuous improvement across all systems, creating an environment where aircraft cannot assume immunity from ground-based threats at any altitude. The proliferation has created challenges as well. Stinger missiles supplied to Afghan Mujahideen in the 1980s remained in circulation for decades after the Soviet withdrawal. Some missiles appeared in other conflicts, operated by forces American planners never intended to arm. The risk of manpads in terrorist hands has driven significant counterproliferation efforts and export control measures. But the fundamental technology is now widely distributed, and any military force must account for the possibility that adversaries possess effective man-portable air defense. February 25, 1991. Specialist Michael Rodriguez handed the empty Stinger launcher to Private First Class Martinez, who loaded the reload missile. The entire reload process took less than 20 seconds. Rodriguez was ready for a second engagement if necessary. It wasn't. The Iraqi helicopters that survived the first engagement were already beyond visual range, fleeing north at maximum speed. The downed Mi-24 sat in the desert 500 meters away, smoking slightly from the engine damage. An infantry patrol moved toward it cautiously. The Iraqi crew had already surrendered, sitting in the sand with hands visible, making no threatening moves. They would be processed, interrogated, and likely discover that their treatment as prisoners exceeded what they had experienced as active-duty helicopter pilots in the Iraqi Air Force. Later that day, Rodriguez learned his engagement had been one of multiple Stinger firings across the theater that morning. Other teams had engaged other helicopters, some hits confirmed, others probable. Iraqi helicopter activity dropped immediately afterward. The word spread. American infantry possessed missiles that made low-altitude operations suicide. Iraq had believed helicopters were safe from ground forces. They had assumed shoulder-fired missiles couldn't threaten fast-moving aircraft operated by trained pilots. They had concluded that low altitude provided sanctuary from American air superiority. Their doctrine, their training, and their tactical planning all rested on these assumptions. American infantry carried missiles that made every one of those assumptions wrong. The Stinger weighed 34.5 pounds. It cost $38,000. A single soldier could carry it, deploy it in seconds, and engage aircraft worth millions of dollars operated by pilots trained over years. The asymmetry was profound. The implications were devastating. Iraqi helicopter pilots learned quickly that there was no safe altitude. Fly high, and coalition fighters engaged you with radar-guided missiles. Fly low, and American infantry engaged you with infrared-guided Stingers. The sanctuary didn't exist. The doctrine was wrong, and the war was already lost. The FIM-92 Stinger didn't win Desert Storm by itself, but it contributed to the comprehensive defeat of Iraqi military capability by denying them effective use of their helicopter forces. Without helicopter support, Iraqi ground forces lost reconnaissance capability, anti-armor support, and close air support. They faced coalition forces that retained all those capabilities. The imbalance was unsustainable. A weapon small enough to carry on one shoulder had negated aircraft that represented years of training and millions of dollars in investment. That was the revolution the Stinger represented. That was why Iraq never saw it coming. And that was why modern military aviation would never be the same.